Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so the next slide. And this kind of gives a sense of where these emissions that you can see, of course, from the chart that they have been continuing to climb since 1990 through to 2019, when that's the data they're using for the report. And most of it is fossil fuel industry related. And then we have the other sort of suspects that are in the mix, and that is the land use and methane, which is why there was a side agreement on methane to try to reduce the quantity of methane being released into the atmosphere, because there was a recognition through these scientific studies that it was becoming a much larger portion of the greenhouse gases. And of course, I think most of us know that methane is much more powerful even than CO2, although it doesn't last as long in the environment as CO2 does. So the next slide, please. But there are some encouraging words in the report, which is always good to know. So next slide, please. So the big key message, and this is the message that we were trying to get across with the election material that our subgroup did, is that unless there are immediate and deep emission reductions, we're not going to reach this 1.5 degrees. So this is the political message that is urgent for this upcoming election, and it's a definite message for our new collaborative government in Ottawa. Next slide, please. So the other interesting thing is that people say, well, you know, we can't do more than we're doing, except a lot of countries are. They're having steady decreases because they have put strategies in place, and Canada has not. And Ontario is going to get worse and worse, as we noted in the material for the election, because Ontario is doing all the wrong things, and that's why we're so concerned about this upcoming election. And the other interesting thing in the report is that where the real work is being done, and maybe this is a conversation we need to have, is it's in the cities. It's in smaller regions. It's in localities who are ignoring their federal and provincial or state or regional governments and going it alone to make changes locally. And that is a very interesting kind of thing to contemplate. Next slide, please. The cost. This comes up as an argument against doing anything about fossil fuels because the traditional oil and gas is so much cheaper. But that, in fact, is changing dramatically and is not the same as it was before. And these charts show the costs are reducing for alternative energy sources. And from an economic perspective, and this is the argument that Mark Carney makes in shifting finance, is that the return on investment is better for renewables than it is for traditional oil and gas. Next slide, please. Yes, electricity systems, and this is the one thing that was also in our report, are increasingly internationally being powered by renewables. And there are some countries that are close to, or there are 3 or 4 countries that are 100% renewables, and many that are in the high 80s and 90s. And in fact, in Canada, 65% of our renewables, of our energy is renewables through the country. And in Ontario, it's something like 82%, and it's 100% in Quebec, and it's very high in Manitoba. Of course, Manitoba and Quebec are lucky in that regard because they have so much hydropower that they built up over the years. So that's another sort of encouraging thing. It can be done, is the point. Next slide, please. And this is just the usual chart we see is that the trend for current implemented policies is that red line at the top, which shows essentially an increase. In other words, the trend for the policies have to change. We have to get much more serious about limiting global warming to 1.5. So the next slide, please. And the hope is, and of course the attempt is to stabilize where we are. Like the understanding from scientists is that what we are experiencing currently with weather events is already locked in, that's not going to change, which is one of the reasons why adaptation is so critical, because assuming we stopped emissions right now, we would still have the current difficulties we're having with extreme climate situation. So the urgency to make sure we reach net zero and stay below 1.5 is critical, because, as I say, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of the disruption. So I'm going to go to the next slide and then pass it on to Jennifer.
All right. Am I speaking?
You are.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if my sound was on. Okay, so just as a little bit of an intro here, this report is almost 3,000 pages, and it's pretty daunting to begin to cover it. But one thing I discovered was it has about 17 chapters, and each chapter has about 150 pages. And in fact, it is a lot more manageable if, rather than downloading the whole report, you choose a section and say, I'm just going to look at this one. And in fact, the individual chapters are mostly fairly accessible. The summary for policymakers is awful to read. It's just gibberish, I find. But if you actually go to the report itself and you're quite interested in what they suggest for any particular section, it's quite manageable and it's well illustrated, and it's pretty clear. So when we look at these 7 sections of the 17 parts of the report, or chapters in the report, our call document, our climate policy issues for the Ontario election that our advocacy group did issued a few weeks ago, actually covers 4 of these: energy, industry, buildings, and transport. We didn't really look at land use. We didn't look much at the urban form or at demand and services. But I think we did one thing that's really interesting when we see what the IPCC reported or recommended, their strategies that they talked about in the 4 sectors that we did cover, is that we did a pretty good job. We've recommended a lot of the same things that they said were absolutely necessary. So that felt really good to be looking at. Can I have the next slide, please? So in the energy sector, worldwide, the energy sector produces 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions now. So from burning coal, oil, natural gas, and so on, and from the emissions that come from producing those products. So even though our emissions are lower in Ontario, one of the things that's really important to think about is having an electricity system, an energy system that can support the changes in the other sectors that are needed. That is to say, the widespread electrification that needs to occur. To go back to the reduction in fossil fuel use, of course, this is the opposite of what's happening in Ontario, where the plans are for the government to expand our use of natural gas in the electricity sector. And I'm going to leave the carbon capture and storage for a later discussion. But what we do need to do, and it's pretty clear we can do from what Michael already pointed out, is rapidly expand our renewable sources of energy. And in Ontario, because we're next door to Quebec, drawing on their surplus electricity produced in their hydro systems would allow for this to happen. With respect to alternative fuels, that's something that we didn't really address ourselves. And I will talk a little bit more about this later, but I think it's really important to look at hydrogen and sustainable biofuels. When I first looked at least the sustainable biofuels side of it, I was feeling fairly skeptical about it, and I still have some skepticism. But in fact, there are biofuels being produced from things like sugarcane, creating ethanol, for example, a plant called Jatropha, which is produced from sisal in Mexico, for example, which is an alternative jet fuel, it turns out. I'm not sure how much they can produce, but anything that reduces emissions from aviation is probably a good idea. There's a massively produced plant in Australia that can be used as that can be produced an alternative to diesel, and so on. So there are sustainable biofuels that we may have to look at, and it might be interesting for Call to look at some point. Hydrogen too, there was a big foofara about hydrogen in the early 90s when Ballard was producing a lot of, and still is actually, producing a lot of fuel cells, and they were touting it mostly for automobiles then. But it appears that hydrogen, in fact, is going to be much more useful for power backup systems, for example, and they are producing fuel cells to back up hospitals for power outages or other kinds of very essential services. And if the hydrogen is produced with green electricity, splitting water molecules, essentially what it does to produce oxygen and hydrogen, then it can be a fairly important element in our transition. And one last thing is, it isn't shown on this slide, but in fact, the report discussed the importance of decentralizing the energy networks, getting power from multiple localized energy sources, whether that's solar or wind or small hydro and so on, rather than one major electricity grid, which has more potential for going down. Next slide, please. The other thing that we didn't talk about much in our report was what they call demand side strategies, which is really, and they said there was untapped potential to actually reduce emissions through these. So it's mostly nudging consumers to more sustainable choices. And they analyzed 60 different potential areas of action where individuals or small companies or large companies for that matter, but individual actors could reduce emissions by changing behaviors. And it turns out of the top 5 of the 60 they examined, walking and cycling, switching from driving to walking and cycling was the biggest bang for your buck, or for lack of your buck, I guess. They did point out, however, that walking and cycling, some of the other changes in behavior that could lead to emissions reductions, it aren't just up to individuals, that you need to create systemic changes, changes in policy, changes in infrastructure, and so on, to make this possible, as we've seen with bicycle lanes and safe pedestrian areas and so on. So the second of these was using electrified transport, which we'll talk a bit more about later. The third was reducing air travel. We really do need to reduce air travel. Again, this is not just individual decisions, but decisions by individual companies to reduce business travel, governments, and so on. Adapting houses was the fourth one, and we've talked a lot about that during energy efficient renovations, changing out fossil fuel heating and cooling systems for heat pumps and that kind of thing. And then balanced plant-based diets. I was actually surprised to see that as their number 5. So some of the lifestyle changes that could in fact dramatically reduce emissions. Again, I've been a little skeptical about, but they're seeing it as a really positive area of action. They do point out that wealthier individuals have the highest potential for emissions reductions as investors, consumers, role models, and professionals. So I'm actually not against, helping people buy electric vehicles, for example, or subsidizing those kinds of things, because it takes emissions out of the system, and it also provides an example for other people. Can I have the next slide, please? So with respect to transportation, really reducing demand is the top issue, and they're talking about demand in a number of different ways. So for example, one of the problems we have in North America is that in the last 2 or 3 decades, the demand for individual vehicles has been strongly increasing toward heavier and larger vehicles, the SUV and van population. So reducing demand is not just fewer vehicles, but it's different kinds of vehicles. Also reducing the frequency and the distance traveled is also a demand reduction, and the dependence on high energy or intensive modes. So electric vehicles, they say, is the greatest potential for reducing emissions in transportation, but that it needs improved battery technologies, particularly for heavier vehicles, for example, which could alternatively use the hydrogen fuel cells for their work. We looked, when I was involved in a project underground at Inco Mines in the 90s, where we were looking at the potential for using fuel cell vehicles in the mines to replace diesel vehicles, and which would have dramatically reduced not only greenhouse gas emissions, but the diesel emissions that cause cancer in workers. So there are positive possibilities there. Let's see. Of course, the other part of it is shifting transportation demand to low emissions public transport, both intra and intercity transport. Okay, next slide, I think. Or actually, just last point there. Of course, the emissions reduction requires decarbonizing the power sector, that is to say, decreasing fossil fuel and electricity generation. Next slide, please. Karen, are you having trouble getting to?
My
What would you
sound
like?
is cut out. Has anyone else's cut out?
I was
Sorry,
hearing
everyone.
you.
My sound has cut out.
We're
I
hearing
can't
you.
believe it. We've got like
Multiple
phantom
problems, yeah.
stuff going on.
I
I
can,
see everyone's lips moving and I can't hear anyone.
Okay, I was asking for the next slide, Karen. And you can't get to it?
put it in the chat,
This has
Jennifer.
never happened to me.
So
I'm going to
she's still
have to
not
leave
hearing.
the meeting and come back, Michael. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, before you leave?
She can't hear you anyhow.
Okay, right.
I'm going to see if I can. Can you, Jennifer, can you see
Yeah.
the slides? Okay.
I can see the, yeah. We need to get to 16.
There
There it is.
it is.
Cities and urban areas, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so this was something we didn't look at in the call document specifically, but is an important area. The point that the IPCC makes is that 2/3 of global emissions come from cities in one form or another, both emissions that are produced in cities, for example, in transportation and building use of fossil fuels and so on. Also the materials that are used in cities, both the construction materials and materials for roads and that kind of thing, and also waste in cities. One thing they pointed out, as Michael said earlier, that they're becoming more active on the mitigation front. We see more cities like Toronto developing mitigation policies. And they're also becoming more active in the IPCC itself, sending people to IPCC meetings and contributing there. So what are the main areas in which we can reduce emissions in cities? Well, better urban planning is really essential. Urban densities have actually been declining since 1970, and they need to go to in the other direction if we're going to reduce encroachment on agricultural lands, suburbanite sprawl, and all of that kind of thing. This means we need to be doing infilling in cities. We need to be repurposing and retrofitting building stock. We need support for non-motorized and public transport. We need to be co-locating neighborhoods where jobs, housing, and services are all provided so that people don't have to travel as far. All those kinds of things are really essential for better urban planning for reducing emissions. A second area is in sustainable production and consumption of goods and services. I hadn't really thought of this before as a city issue, but it does become a real issue, as I said, with respect to materials being used. One example that they gave, for example, is in the use of construction materials. They were talking about reducing the use of steel and concrete in buildings, for example, by substituting engineered timber systems. We're not talking about doing massive old growth forest destruction in order to provide huge timbers as they used to do for big buildings, but engineered wood, which takes pieces of wood and glues it together. And it turns out to be both very strong and very fireproof, actually. And is occurring in Vancouver, for example, is taking the lead on doing a lot of this now. So it's one area where the sustainable production of goods and services can reduce emissions. They list many more that I don't have time to go into. Electrification, of course, actually, there's one more area that I want to look at, which is waste, because part of the consumption issue is the production of huge amounts of waste, which is really unsustainable, and our recycling systems are really not up to the task of taking this. So creating a more circular economy, producer responsibility for goods, creating more long-lived and repairable products, and having repair centers and so on as part of our job creation strategies. Remanufacturing, all of those kinds of things are important to do in cities and elsewhere as part of emissions reduction strategy. Electrification, building, for building, heating and cooking, transport, and so on. And then finally, carbon uptake and storage. And they have a really nice piece in their chapter about urban green and blue infrastructure, where they talk about the importance of street trees, parks, sustainable urban drainage systems of taking care of stormwater, for example, green roofs, green walls, and blue spaces, ponds, streams, and wetlands within the urban fabric that both reduce emissions, but also provide adaptation. They reduce heat, they manage water, stormwater, so that there's less flooding, and so on. So there's real co-benefits to urban green and blue infrastructure and for carbon uptake. Next slide. Buildings. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on buildings, partly because I think our section in our call document on this does a really, really good job about what's necessary to reduce emissions from buildings. So as they say, action this decade is really critical to fully capture this potential, and we can get there. But really a big part of the focus has to be on retrofitting existing buildings and then using effective mitigation techniques in new buildings. So we need funds for retrofits. We need bans on new gas-fired heating and cooling systems in buildings. We need updated building codes. We need job training and social enterprises to reach the emissions reduction in in buildings in cities and elsewhere. Next slide, please. Industry, we also dealt with this, so our focus in our call document was more on heavy industry, whereas they're looking at industry more generally. About 25% of global emissions are determined to come from industrial emissions. And it is really challenging, particularly for heavy industries like cement production, chemicals production, and so on, to reduce emissions. Partly because a lot of these industrial processes require a huge amount of heat, which is actually hard to produce with electrification. It is partly easier to produce with hydrogen, which if we produce green hydrogen again with by electrifying water using from hydro, for example, nighttime hydro, and for the purposes of producing the hydrogen. Hydrogen can substitute for fossil fuels in a lot of these production processes. Their chapter discusses options for steel, concrete, industrial feedstock operations, and so on, as well as light industry. Light industry, some manufacturing, some assembly, and so on, has a much easier chance of being electrified. But where it isn't, where for the heavier industries, we both need to look at using products from those heavy industries, less like concrete, for example, and some chemical products. But there is the research going on, which is piloting alternatives in these industries that need to be scaled up and applied more broadly. And of course, where necessary, some carbon capture and storage. Again, I'm going to get into that in a little bit later, but it is clear that achieving net zero is going to be challenging here, and carbon capture and storage, or carbon removal, is going to be an important element of the strategy on the industrial side. Next slide, please. So they actually don't have a chapter on carbon dioxide removal as such. And when we think of carbon dioxide removal, all too often we're thinking about carbon capture and storage. And in fact, they put a huge amount of emphasis in their report, not on carbon capture and storage, though they do address it, but on natural systems, natural solutions to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're talking about things like reforestation and afforestation and soil carbon sequestration. I'm going to get into that a bit more in a minute. But because I'm going to backtrack a bit on my notes here. So what they need is they need carbon dioxide removal to counteract from hard to eliminate emissions, such as aviation, for example. Agriculture, you can reduce emissions in agriculture, but it's going to be hard to eliminate them altogether. And some industrial processes. It's also going to be hard with wars going on that are producing massive amounts of emissions, but that's another issue. So they actually they did a really neat chart in this, looking at a variety of solutions. And as I said, natural solutions are a big part of this. So afforestation, reforestation, and improved forest management, i.e. reducing or eliminating as much as possible clear cutting in forestry, and especially clear cutting the Amazon and other kinds of areas like that. Soil carbon sequestration, i.e. regenerative agriculture, so agricultural practices that sequester carbon in the soils, including one called biochar, which is really interesting. I usually think of burning off agricultural waste as just producing a huge amount more of emissions, but in fact you can burn some agricultural waste in a way to produce charcoal, which captures a lot of the carbon from these materials. Add the charcoal to compost, and it ends up it's not removing carbon, the word is gone, storing it underground. There's also peatland and coastal wetland restoration, which is a really significant part of this, and also what they call blue carbon management, improving and expanding instead of cutting down mangrove swamps, improving and expanding tidal marshes, and planting seagrasses all can contribute to carbon sequestration. They also mentioned 2 geoengineering projects, which I still have some doubts about. Ocean alkalinity enhancement, adding alkaline substances to seawater, which is, ostensibly enhances the ocean's carbon sink, and ocean fertilization with things like iron to stimulate phytoplankton and draw down carbon. I'm going to have to do more reading about this, but this is something that they have been suggesting as is essential. That we need methods for measuring, reporting, and verifying these kinds of methods in national inventories. Next slide, please. Land use. So agriculture and forestry can, in fact, provide large-scale emissions reduction. And protecting and restoring natural ecosystems is essential to this, as it's written on the slide. Protecting our forests, our peatlands, our coastal wetlands, savannas, and grasslands. We do have to manage competing demands. So on the one hand, our land provides food for us, livelihoods for foresters, for farmers, for people who work with the products of farms and forests and so on. But there are competing demands. One of the areas where we have a competing demand we really have to consider in Ontario is the Ring of Fire, where ostensibly there are areas that provide chemicals that are essential for solar systems, for example, and for batteries, lithium, for example. But at the same time, it provides massive peat areas in the north, and also should be controlled by the Indigenous peoples who have never given up responsibility in those areas. So those demands have to be really carefully managed, and there may be points at which mitigation and Indigenous peoples' responsibilities, and they just have to be. They're in conflict with one another. So we have to think about those kinds of things. But land use cannot compensate for delayed emissions reductions in other sectors. We can't do it all by planting forests and so on. Next slide, please. These next 4 slides are not really as much in my area of knowledge, but I will try my best. When they looked at investment gaps or finances, for mitigating, they indicated both at a national and at the international level that financial flows have to be basically 3 to 6 times higher than they currently are for mitigation to occur at a sufficient level. So there is sufficient capital available. A lot of it's going into things like Elon Musk's activities. But it could be, if it could be diverted to mitigation, it would be a huge plus. We see this in banks in Canada, for example. Canada's Big 5 are all in the top 20 investors in fossil fuels in the world. RBC alone ranks 5th in the world. This is a small to medium-sized country that doesn't have huge financial sector, but it's really responsible for a lot of emissions, and we need to be able to change that. So there needs to be governance addressed to this issue. The other thing about investing in mitigation to the level required is it will make a big difference for adaptation costs from around the world. So we have to balance money spent on mitigation and adaptation and the cost that might come from impact if we don't. And that's an important financial consideration. Next slide, please. The IPCC shows that a lot of the regulatory and economic instruments that are in place or being trialed in a variety of locations are showing to be effective, and they including a real mix both of standards, regulations, building codes, carbon taxes, emissions trading, other kinds of things. One thing is clear is that you can't have a single instrument that's going to do the job. Carbon taxes by themselves will not do the job. You need comprehensive policy packages. And again, we talked about this in our call document. But these need to be strengthened and expanded and as I say, comprehensive. And this also requires coordination across governments and businesses and civil society. Okay. Next slide, please. And last one for me, technology and innovation. Again, I've always been a little bit skeptical about putting all your eggs in the technology and innovation basket, which is certainly what the Ontario government has done in its climate change program, that most of their emissions are going to come from some magical technology and innovation. By the same token, technology and innovation is making a big difference. For example, as Michael mentioned, with the dramatic improvement in solar energy capacity, but also the dramatic drop in costs for producing solar energy. So we do need to still have policies that push towards lower emissions technologies, energy efficient appliances, improved forest and crop management strategies and practices, and so on. And we need to invest in technical and scientific training. A lot is going on, but one of the big barriers is getting these to be applied at scale, which is going to require that financial investment that we mentioned in the previous slide. So that's it for me. Michael, over to you. And next slide.
Sure. I'm going to make this really quick because we have, have little time left, but we really want to have a discussion. So one of the relationships in this report is related to the whole concept of sustainable development. And these are the sustainable development goals. And if our policies were taking into account the sustainable development goals, the SDGs as they're commonly called, probably our policy framework, both provincially, federally, municipally, and so on, would be a bit different. If every policy decision, if every piece of legislation, if budgets, government budgets were designed with these things in mind, we might have a quite a bit different approach to our future than we currently do, because our decisions are generally taken around the growth concept and how do we grow the economy? How do we make sure everybody's got a good paying job? How do we make sure that the tax revenues from those jobs flow to government so they can provide services to people? But they don't take into account these goals, generally speaking, or they do haphazardly. So I'm going to skip a few of these things because it's we don't have time for it all. And this really is essentially just the summary that the time for action is now. I think the other thing that became very clear is we keep talking about, oh, we have 10 years. Well, the report says we've got 4 to 5 years in order to stabilize everything, and that time frame is one election cycle in our country. So I think that's where I'll stop sharing, and we can go to a discussion. I do have something I wanted to try to give an example of this SDGs and how they relate to current provincial government policy. And if we have time, I'll go through that. But I also have a hard stop for myself today at 11:30, so I would have to leave. And I'm going to pass on the co-hosting as well to Jennifer in case somebody wants to stay a little bit longer. We usually have, another sort of up to a half hour after for discussions, but I won't be able to stay. So let's get into discussion mode. I know there's some questions that Michael has put in the chat, some clarification questions. And then Dennis has a comment. So what I do is just, let's just, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask whatever you were asking in the chat. And we will try to answer as best we can.
Are you asking me to?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, if you'd start, Michael, and then Dennis.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've talked about it before, but biochar is particularly useful. And also the fact that biochar can be made from a product that is waste like sewage. And so I'm reminding you of things I've spoken about before, and I won't make it too long to keep in mind what you just said. So biochar can be made from sewage. It can be made from manure. Manure, if it's left untreated, produces a great deal of methane, obviously, which is even worse than CO2. So that's a double a good benefit. From sewage also, it's another benefit. So biochar rates very close to the increasing reforestation. And also another aspect is that in Western Canada, they used to burn the aftermath of growing wheat and other grains. And that can be turned into paper. And a company that made paper from that was in place for many years, but then because the government didn't give financial benefit to to making the paper from a renewable a product. In other words, to keep it simple, it was cheaper to buy paper made from virgin wood than it is from straw that's now burned. So those are a few of the aspects that I'm pointing out to.
Great,
Okay.
thanks, Michael. And did you get an answer to what carbon uptake is? Are you okay with that now?
Quick response. What is carbon uptake?
You had asked about what carbon uptake.
No, I didn't get an answer.
You're okay. Okay.
No, I'm
good.
not.
Oh, you're not. Oh,
Is it-
so Jennifer, maybe you could explain what carbon uptake is in the report. It was on one of the slides.
It's just taking up carbon from the atmosphere, from whether that's through in the form of trees taking in and storing carbon or other systems.
Including carbon capture and storage, I assume.
Yeah, although, yeah, I suppose.
It's a non-natural way
Yeah.
of taking up carbon. Yeah. Okay. Dennis, and then Judith and Liz. Or Dennis, is Dennis here?
Yes, I'm here.
There you are. Yeah.
Right. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Ballard Power's fuel cells are being used on a large scale in China to make hydrogen buses. Really large scale, thousands of buses. And with regard to biochar, it's being manufactured now with concentrated solar power from agave plants that are being used to make tequila. So I like to think, when I'm drinking margaritas, I'm helping.
It's sustainable.
Sustainable. I love it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Judith?
Yes. Well, that whole thing about biochar, I mean, I hear, the clarion call from Michael and other people, but I don't see it in any of the projections or, ideas for innovation, etc. So I don't know, except for tequila, where it is actually being done. That's one question. And secondly, my bank is RBC and I feel embarrassed to have my money there. And it's a hell of a big change to change pension and all that stuff. But where do I go? Is TD any better? Or any ideas?
Can I
That was my two
respond to the,
questions.
I'd like to respond to RBC first because I'm the president of my condo association and we bank with RBC. And there's been a big campaign in the last month against RBC. They had their annual general meeting and there was a lot of talk at that meeting, prior to that meeting, and demonstrations out in front of the meeting and so on, demanding that they reduce or stop fossil fuels. So there's actually a really great article which I can send out on firing your bank, basically, and what you need to do to go through it. And it's really helpful. So I'm proposing that to our condo association, and we'll be following up with that. But I do think it's important to do that, and to tell them why you're doing it is going to be essential as well. The alternatives are, most of the credit unions in the country offer, in fact, most of the services that banks have. And we have about half of our assets at Alterna, for example, and we've had some grumbling about them, but in fact, they do no investments in fossil fuels whatsoever. So those credit unions are a possibility. There was an article in the National Observer too about a month ago. I think it was the National Observer. It might have been another organization, but I've also got that saved away, and I can send that out if you like, about the different credit unions and how they answer the questions about where their investments go and so on. And but I think it doesn't hurt to start moving these things. So I'll send those out to people. With respect to biochar, I personally don't know much about biochar, and I have to confess, I didn't read from cover to cover every chapter that I reported on. In some of them, I looked at the executive summaries. In some of them, I went further because I knew less about it. But biochar wasn't something I paid a lot of attention to, so I can't really respond.
But yeah, let me just add a couple of things. I think this might have been the first IPCC report that did talk about biochar. So that's an interesting sort of step forward for that technology. And secondly, the materials that Jennifer is talking about, if she can send them to me, I'll send them out with all the other follow-up to this meeting, because I've got a whole bunch of stuff to send to people after the meeting. And well, Meridian Credit Union has branches all over the city. And we've been with them for 15 years, I think. They have absolutely every service you could possibly think of, and they don't invest in fossil fuels at all.
Actually, this report, I think it was the National Observer, but I can't swear to it, said that they say that less than 1% of their investments are in fossil fuels. So it isn't 100%. But I intend to go up to the local branch and say, okay, so tell me, do you have any investments in fossil fuels? But Meridian definitely is a big player and does have all the services possible and lots of.
And I think the document that Jennifer mentioned that tells you how to do it, any bank, any credit union, they do this automatically for you now, because there's all kinds of systems that automate the process of getting both where your money comes from and where your money goes, because there's a lot of automated payments as well. And these institutions will have these incredible systems to help you with that stuff. So it's not quite as difficult as it used to be.
Okay, thank you.
And Liz and
Yeah.
Liz, did I talk?
Linda and Karen. Okay, good.
Michael.
Oh, sorry, Michael, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, two things in 2 minutes. One I sent out before, I think. It's an article on Scientific American. I'll make it very quick. This is the cost, and this is compared to different technologies. Direct air is around 200 to 300. Bioenergy is 100 to 200. Biochar is between 50 and 100. Forestry is between 0 and 100. Those are actual figures on a Scientific American article. And I think that's very interesting.
Okay. Thanks. Liz.
Yeah, I just have a question about carbon capture's use and sequestration, which has been allocated a huge amount of the most recent federal budget. And I was wondering if either of you have come to any conclusions as a result of reading the IPCC report about how feasible any of those measures are and if they can actually be scaled up to make a difference.
I can sort of comment on what I've read. It's certainly not my analysis, but what other researchers have read is that most of what they're talking about in terms of investments are sort of unknown technologies. So who knows whether it'll work or not. And a vast majority of it is tied to allowing the oil and gas industry to continue to pump oil and gas. And that is not the solution. It's just the wrong place to put the investment. That's what
Okay.
I've read. Jennifer,
That's what
I don't
I've
know.
read. I was wondering if the IPCC weighed in on it. That was all.
Yeah, I don't remember anything in particular, Jennifer.
It didn't leap out at me. I certainly read through that section of their report, which, as I say, wasn't actually in a chapter on the carbon capture. They really did emphasize more the natural systems production. It doesn't leap out at me, the direct air carbon capture and storage I would think that, yeah, it doesn't leap out at me as something they thought was necessary, but they're still saying, whoa, it's still very much at low-level pilot strategies, and it's not at all clear unless we invest a huge amount more into it that it will work. And they aren't proposing it as a solution to keep oil and gas going. It's more for things like cement and steel production and so on, which are hard to produce without the use of fossil fuels, you know.
Linda, I think Tyndall, I think you had a comment to make on this.
I did actually, because this is what I basically studied when I first joined this group. And one of the things about it is, or the two things about it is, first of all, they're only big energy companies and not necessarily fossil fuel that are doing it in the U.S. We only have one possibility here in Saskatchewan, actually. And secondly, it's a long-term, heavy investment. So it's not going to be online, something like this, for probably 10 years. So, that takes us to well past 2030.
Right.
For what potential?
Right. Thanks, Linda. And the other Linda.
Okay, thank you. The agenda went by rather quickly, so I'm not sure whether this was on it, but I was wondering if we're going to eventually start talking about getting organized for the provincial election campaign. Because I'm thinking that if it's this group, we might want to start analyzing platforms and getting organized in our ridings and finding the candidate one best to work for, all of that. Are we going to have discussions about this at some point?
Well, we were hoping, if we hadn't lost so much time, we were hoping to get at a bit of that by the end of this meeting, but I don't think that's going to happen because we're rapidly running out of time. It's 11:20 already. Part of what I was going to send out after this meeting was the connection to the organizations that we're engaged with around the election and trying to encourage our engagement with those organizations, which are doing exactly what you just suggested we should be doing. And so there will be sort of more information than I sent out after the meeting about that, but in terms of having a discussion about how this group might do something different from what the two main organizations are that we're engaged with. We didn't plan for that discussion, although one of the agenda items was where do we go from here with this subcommittee?
Fair enough. So the general thrust for this group is to link up with other groups if we want to get in.
That's correct, rather than going out and trying to do something ourselves, because they're already engaged and they've got whole systems in place, and it would be a lot easier just to tag on to those efforts than try to do something separately ourselves.
Okay, thanks.
Jennifer.
I was thinking it might make sense, though, for us to not wait a month for the next advocacy group meeting to discuss those, and for some of us to be saying, I'm going to be doing this, I'm going to be doing that, I'm going to do the other thing. I would recommend not waiting for a month, because the writ will drop before a month is out.
That's right.
And if we want to have, I think it doesn't hurt for us as an organization. Well, as individuals, we may join other actions. We might want to do it in the name of call, in part. So that would be my suggestion. Another
Okay,
meeting
we can discuss that as well at the end. Janet. Muted, Janet.
Sit here for an hour and a half muted and you forget you're muted. I agree with Jennifer. I think maybe a meeting in the next couple of weeks as we're coming up to the writ. Also, I heard something on the news, and I've been working on something else lately. So the Ontario government has made changes to its environmental policies, and I've not seen anything clearly laid out in anywhere. I just wondered if anybody has, or if anybody has any insight into what's been happening.
Yes, it was released on, I think it was, just before the holidays, so nobody would read it. And there have been commentaries that I have seen but have not read yet on it. I think it was in the National Observer and perhaps in Energy Mix, one of those two. So that could be, I think that would be something that we would have to take a look at. If we're going to meet in a couple of weeks, we could get that material together and get it out to people.
Something about energy tax credits that companies were going to be able to buy, and then the money was going to go back to keep hydro rates low, or some, it sounded like a very absurd idea.
Yeah, I think we're going to find that it's not much of an environmental plan, but we'll have to really take a look at what the commentators say and take a look at the plan ourselves. We could do that. It's online now.
Okay.
Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left before the official end of the meeting happens. I was going to describe a situation that fits sort of the SDGs and how it relates to something local. I'm not going to do that because it would take too long. But if we do meet in a couple of weeks, I could go over that as an example of Ontario government policy that is ignoring both the Sustainable Development Goals and ignoring the climate by forcing two MZOs that they also released just on Friday, I think on Good Friday at 4 o'clock, or Thursday at 4 o'clock, sorry. And it has to do with Vaughan, the region of Vaughan, and in Richmond Hill and Markham, where they have allowed what is going to become the third densest neighborhood in the world. It'll come after the neighborhood in Mumbai, the one that was featured in Slumdog Millionaire, and the second is a neighborhood in Hong Kong. And these developments will create 175,000 people per square kilometer. And their argument is that this is like the 15-minute city solution. Markham City Council has asked the province to cancel the MCO and let the local planning processes go ahead. In Markham, they had an entire plan for reducing urban sprawl and having a logical plan development along a transit route in Markham. And that now is just millions of dollars was spent on this plan. And it's just tossed aside so that the government can approve these developments. And the developer happens to be the largest contributor to the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. So it gives you a sense of what's going on. I think it's worth talking about, but probably in the context of the election. But what this example does is it just draws on all this material from the IPCC and in relation to sustainable development goals. It's actually quite interesting to see how the mistakes that are being made by this government in going ahead and building these incredibly complex neighborhoods without any planning process. This is just to make the developers wealthy. It has nothing to do with climate change. It has nothing to do with local needs of communities and neighborhoods and cities and towns as they evolve. It's just a cynical ploy to make somebody rich. Yet it incorporates a lot of the concepts that we talk about a lot. 15-minute cities. We need better density. We have to, they start this whole thing by saying we're stopping urban sprawl. Now, in the meantime, of course, what are they doing? They're building highways 413 and all these to encourage sprawl. But it's clearly not government policy driving this. It has to do with money. So I think it'll be a very interesting conversation to have. And I would suggest we tack it on to a question about what we do about the next election and have a meeting in a couple of weeks just to talk about the election. And maybe we could start it out with this example so we get a sense of what are the issues that we individually could take on in relation to talking to a candidate or writing a letter or joining another group who's working on the election. So that's sort of my suggestion how to go forward. And Jennifer and Janet, I think, unless you're still.
I think that's a good idea, Michael. In fact, I was going to talk a little bit about Markham City Council, but I don't think it's the time for it. I think if we have that discussion later, I could talk to you about a little history with them, which is good history, actually. So I think it's a good idea.
Okay. Janet.
Just a comment. My MPP was at the doorway, and her response when challenged on the use of MZOs was to say that, well, they had been used to build long-term care homes, and wasn't that a good idea? So,
the private long-term care homes.
Yeah.
Oh, public, just, why build in a wetland? Anyway.
Yeah, it's a big issue. The province has used, this government has used MZOs in the last 2 years 44 times. It was used once a year prior to that.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And yeah, she came saying, I hope I can get your support. And 10 minutes later, she was backing off my front steps. So I wasn't even finished.
Good
Linda.
for you, Janet.
Maybe we could look at what any policies that have been released by the parties before the next time we meet in 2 weeks, just so we're up to date.
Yep, we can attach a link to those. That's a good idea. The Liberals still haven't issued theirs yet.
Please.
Okay.
I was thinking that they've released so many things in the last few weeks, that it would actually be good to have a list of them, both when your MPP comes to the door, you can say, hey, look at all these things that you've done, your bribes for the election and so on. But also that would provide ammunition for questions in the all candidates meetings and things like that. So I'm not sure I'm offering to do it.
Yeah. Today's
Yeah, well,
CBC
that was my next
is-
question. Is there somebody who would want to take that on?
I don't mind taking it on, because they released today that the PCs prior to the budget have announced $11 billion in perks.
Well, this is the kind of information that would be really useful if we meet again. So if Linda, if you wanted to take on sort of a, whatever you can find kind of summary of what they've been up to lately, that would be helpful.
Could somebody please also help me? Because
Yeah, is there somebody who would step up to help Linda?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So as I said before, I have to leave, but the meeting will continue to go even though I'm not here. So I passed down a hosting to both Karen and Jennifer.
Oh, I'm glad you posted it to Karen too.
And, and two, just in case. I could do even more if somebody else wants to be a co-host.
Thank you,
Okay.
Michael. I just
Good
want to say
recovery
thank you,
today, Michael. Well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's annoying to lose that time because we all don't have a lot of time. So if just pick a date for the next meeting. I mean, we could do it in 2 weeks, same time, same day, if you want. I don't know what that means, but
that's our monthly meeting, 2 weeks
Oh,
today.
that's right.
when Carolyn's
that doesn't
presenting
work.
on the youth climate activism.
Right. I don't have my calendar in front of me, so I'll let you sort of sort that out and continue to have a discussion about this if you'd like. I think we have a sense of direction, at least for the next meeting, whenever we can figure out when to do it. And then I will leave. Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Maybe we should try for the meeting time first because people will probably fall away now. Does anyone have suggestions? I don't have my calendar in front of me either.
Well, the thing is, I have my calendar. Wednesdays is always going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Because we have 3 different meetings already committed, actually 4. What about Monday? Either the 2nd or the 9th, preferably the 9th.
Liz has suggested the 5th.
What is the date the writ drops? Jennifer, do you know?
It's right around then. I think it's May the 4th or something, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking it was the 4th or 5th.
But there's also a budget before then. The PCs are
on the 28th. On the 28th, the budget.
Yes.
So maybe after the budget and before the writ drops?
I think that would be a good idea.
Okay, so the 2nd?
Can you do the 2nd, Linda?
No, I can't actually, but the other Linda, I'm a secondary character here. So
what day did you say?
I just the 2nd or the 3rd. 3rd is a Tuesday. I don't know what people's Tuesdays are like.
Okay, so that Monday, the natural based solutions are going to help plant trees on Monday.
Monday the 2nd?
Yes.
Okay.
And but I could do the 3rd, which is Tuesday. Linda, can you do the 3rd, which is Tuesday?
Are you asking Linda Tyndall?
No, I'm asking Linda
Oh,
Lewis.
you're asking me? Yes, I could do the 3rd.
Okay, so shall we
Hands
tentatively?
up for the 3rd. How
Yeah.
many people? Just put your hand up on the screen. One.
Yeah.
Looks like the 3rd is pretty good. Okay. Let's do that. Morning or afternoon?
Oh, morning for me.
Morning.
Morning.
How about
Morning.
same time at 10?
Mhm.
10 a.m. Okay.
Okay,
Like a plan.
May 3rd at 10.
okay, fine.
Okay.
So-
Who will send out the meeting invitation? Will that be Michael?
I think you will. Yeah, we just inform him of the meeting time and date we suggested, and I think we can do that.
Okay. Good. I need to go and get my glasses fixed. So thank you very much. It was a great meeting, and I got to get in there and read the IPPC report. So thanks, everyone.
One chapter at a time.
Yeah, one mouthful at a time.
Linda, could you please tell me your email address or put it in the chat or something?
Can I just tell it to you
Yes.
before you go? It's LWSHEP 28
LW
SHEP
EP
28 at gmail.com.
Okay, I'm just going to repeat this. LWSHEP 28.
Yep.
Jennifer Penny, thank you very much for your commentary. Well done.
Very well done. Thank
Great,
you so
Jennifer.
much. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. I always feel like I go on too long, and I've never been good at giving short presentations. And then
You
today,
explain it so well so that we
Very
follow.
informative.
thank you. So the day's squeeze wasn't helpful. So, no, and I'm glad for the pieces of expertise that people have in the group, you know, that I don't have, and that I can only take in so much at a time. You know, you can read one of these chapters, you can take in a lot, but you read another one the next day, a lot of what you read the day before kind of disappears. Trying to absorb it all into a 75-year-old brain gets harder and harder. I like to say to people, it's just so packed. I don't have room for new information.
I think it's an argument a lot of us use.
Yeah. Yeah. So were there any other questions or comments people want to make about the IPCC report?
I just wanted to add something I added to the chat, and I'll make sure Michael shares it in the information after this meeting,
Right.
which is that Michael Berger, for the last word on biochar, he'd introduced me to a book that I put in the chat, but I'll make sure it's shared, called Burn. About biochar, and one of the two authors, Kathleen Draper, Michael had brought her up to Toronto for a meeting a few years ago that I videoed. So there's a link to a video I can share too. That's for people who are interested, because it's a lot more information on biochar, and it's really good information. So I'll make sure to share that, like through Michael Barkley.
Great.
Great. Yeah, I think it actually would be really worthwhile at some point after the election for the group, whether that's a general meeting or not, but to look at carbon capture and storage, well, or carbon removal generally, that whole chapter on carbon removal, and what seems possible, what different strategies can achieve, and so on. When Michael Berger talked about this strategy 1 to 100 and so on, I don't know what the figures were that he was referring to. 1 to 100 what? Or...
I can give you very quickly the figures of the dollar cost for the different technologies.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was.
Right. Okay.
The highest is direct air capture. That's why I think that's one of the worst things we could do. The second thing that you mentioned, I think, that it takes 10 years and 10 years is too late.
Right.
We need
Yeah.
something that's now, not in 10 years.
Well, capturing through forests and so on is going to take a time too. You know, that's the whole idea that, well, we can cut down trees and just replace them with little ones, and then we get more. They say, well, we get more carbon capture from the little ones because as they're growing, they're adding carbon. But meantime, you've released a huge amount of carbon to the air by cutting down the previous ones, and carbon from the soil that those trees are planted in, and so none of it is really fast.
No, let me respond to that very quickly. On the chart that I have, it gives a timeline. The timeline is between 0 and 6. Forestry is number 1. Soil sequestration is number 3. So it is quick. It is relatively quick on this chart. And what I should do, Karen, as I'm not great technology-wise, maybe that's a chart that you want to send to the people. It's a one-page chart, and sometimes we keep it very simple. To keep information as simple as we can is a good thing, and we can share that with more people. Can I send it to you at some stage?
Yeah, send it to me or do you have the Scientific American it's from? Do you actually have the?
Yes, I do. It's winter 2019-2020.
Why don't you bring it Friday when we're going on Joanne's wonderful
Yeah.
nature walk?
Okay.
And I'll scan it and make sure it's shared.
Yeah. Thank you.
I guess the other thing I would ask is whether any other aspects of the report would be worth later sessions to tackle more specifically. Is anything that you heard that you thought, I'd like to know more about that?
I have a general one, which is what gets so discouraging is to hear about possibilities and technologies and then hear about, the kind of the greenwashing trickery that's going on. The example being in Vaughan. My sister was actually involved in a deposition, and she lives in Vaughan, and she's part of a rate taxpayers group that was trying to fight both Vaughan and one near to her house at John and Bayview. And so I'd heard this whole story that Michael had told. And so what's scary about it is that they're using the language of what we need to do. Like it's everything like in David Miller's book about smart cities and what we need to do. And so it's very confusing because they're it's exactly what Michael Barkley said. They're trying to make it look like they're doing the right thing. And it's about developers. It's going to be 80 stories, not it. There's a few buildings, but they're going to be like 80 stories, like at Vaughan and Bayview, like insane. But anyhow, so my question about what I would be interested to know of, or to bring in an expert or guests that can talk to a good collaboration between government and developers, like I'd like to know where people are doing it right. As I get so discouraged when I hear about the greenwashing, like, yes, carbon takedown or carbon capture technology is important, but if all the money for it goes to the oil and gas industry so they think they can continue the way they're going, like that's enough to make our skin crawl, right? So, but but who's doing the right thing with that money? Where are examples of government, private sector, climate activist groups working together, whether it's California, I don't know where it is, where we could get a bit of a lift that we hear that there's a bit of it in David Miller's book, which I recently reread, Solved, because he does a lot of examples of cities. I think, Jennifer, you mentioned that, or maybe Michael did at the beginning, that where a lot of action is happening is at the municipal level because it affects buildings and infrastructure locally, and they can avoid all the, the slow moving behemoth of the federal and provincial level. But there are examples in that book. And so I would like to hear where, if we're going to learn about these technologies, where are they being used, not as a greenwashing kind of thing.
Yeah.
With respect to that particular development, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the whole densification thing, because there is this and the IPCC was very strong on this, you know, making cities more dense is really essential. But I see being dense and doing all kinds of 50-story condos as two different sides of the coin. And from the adaptation side, these 50-story condos that are going up are not sustainable. You get a power outage, and people living up in the 44th, 45th, 46th, they're going to get water up there. They're not going to have electricity. They're going to have to be going up and down the staircases and so on. There's all kinds of things that are problematic with it. Plus the glass curtain construction of those buildings, which is really energy inefficient, and which doesn't withstand storms and so on very well. So I think it's really important to get down into the nitty gritty on the question of making cities more dense, and just how to make them livable, how to make them adaptable, how to make them better, because just talking about densification per se doesn't do the job, you know? So
I'd agree with you. I think that this is really a good way to go, to start looking at that, because, you know, going way back to Jane Jacobs and livable cities, and then the intensification. I mean, right where I live, there's a big push against making North York Melasman hub kind of a thing walkable, because of all the cars that need to get to the highway, and worried about bike lanes taking taking too much space for the cars. So, you know, that's in my own backyard, but really we need to know, you know, how it's working well, and what we can do to continue to make it work well.
Maybe David Miller would have some interesting things to say about the Vaughan development.
Michael, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, the Rocky Mountain Institute does a lot of good work, and it has, I think, good news with business, with the environment, and there's some very top level people there. I was going to send Karen something about that the other day, and maybe that's something I can try to connect with Karen, and she can think about that and see how it fits in with the group. Maybe we could tie in with a speaker from there. Maybe we can talk about that Friday, Karen.
Yep. Or feel free to share with I'm just very aware that I have my own business, and I'm very busy with my own video business. So I feel free to share this with the people driving this group too, Michael, whether it's, you know, Jennifer or Michael Barkley, or I don't want to slow down anything. That's all.
That's all I mean, just to share it quickly, same as you share other things.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Take care, Dave. Yeah, the Rocky Mountain Institute, I went to a conference there. It's got to be 20 years ago now. And it's definitely an interesting place, and definitely doing interesting work. So trying to think of a topic that we would want that they might address it. Maybe you could look at it a bit more, Michael. Look specifically at what the RMI is doing now, and is there a topic that we would likely be interested in that we could get somebody from there to speak?
I can try to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably wrap up. We're down to 6 now.
Okay.
And one person isn't in front of his computer. So.
And then there were 5. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. Great summary. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Michael, I'll see you Friday. We'll be in touch. Okay.
Bye-bye.